I'm so excited. Welcome you to our Teaching Justice webinar series. And we are thrilled for today's presentation, which is Teaching Liberatory Justice, featuring Ragini Shah from Suffolk Law. Welcome, Ragini. We're thrilled that you're here.
Hey, everyone. Hey, I'm Layla Halas. I'm the co-committee chair of the Teaching Justice kind of subcommittee of the best practices for CLEA. And we're really excited to have today's talk, which is part of this larger webinar series, Teaching Justice, where we really think about how kind of current social movements influence the way that we teach in clinics and inform the way that we think about what justice is and means and the pedagogy. Every session has a different theme and all sorts of topics at intersections with how we think about teaching justice. And one of the great things about this series is that we record each of these sessions. And so this session, like all of our others, will be recorded, and you can find them on the CLEA website. And we'll be updating that and all the listservs for all of the future sessions this semester as well.
We do want to encourage your interaction using the chat function, or you can raise your physical hands or use your raise hand function over Zoom. Ragini is open to kind of a live interaction, so please don't hesitate. If something occurs to you during the presentation, please do put it in the chat. We will also make time during the presentation for specific questions should they arise. We ask everybody to please mute your microphones if you can, but invite you to share video if you're comfortable. If not, no worries whatsoever. And just to mark your calendars, we do have a couple of teaching justice sessions coming up in April. On the 3rd, we will have Disability Justice featuring Sarah Lohr. And on April 10th, Teaching Early Family Defense with Julia Hernandez and Tariq Ishmael. So mark your calendars, but in the meantime, settle in. Again, we're so excited to listen to Ragini and learn more about liberatory justice. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Layla and Allison, for inviting me. I'm excited to be here, and I see some familiar names and some names I don't know, so I'm excited that you were all able to take some time out. Thank you for making time. I know it's really busy time in clinics, not that there's any time that's not busy, but the middle of the semester. So I appreciate you all taking some time here. And as Allison mentioned, I'm more than happy to have people, engage as I'm talking. So please feel free to interrupt me, either raising your Zoom hand or in the chat. I'll try to monitor it, but I know Layla and Allison will help me monitor the chat if that's okay. So I'm going to be talking today about liberatory justice. And of course, I just lost my screen that I was going to share. Sorry, one second. So this actually comes out of a concurrent session that Patience Crowder, Jennifer Lee, Carla McCanders, and I did at the conference this past April in San Francisco. And so although I'm talking about it today, it really was a collective effort, and the terminology and some of the theory behind it was collectively developed. And even some of the examples I'm going to mention today are from those other clinical teachers. So I just want to say, first of all, acknowledgement and thank you to them for putting all of this together. So I think it might be helpful to kind of start with a definition of what do I mean by liberatory practice, right? Or what did we mean by liberatory practice? Because, yeah, so just a definition might be useful. So for us, it really came from a couple of different places where we were trying to think of what is a way of describing a set of things that we were noticing in our practices that that were challenging us, right? And making us want to think about some different ways of doing things. And the reason we sort of landed on liberatory practice as a way of thinking about it is really two people. And the first is Bell Hooks, who reminded all of us back in the 1990s, right, about, and then her approach in terms of liberation is more about theoretical approach. But Bell Hooks reminds us that theory is not inherently liberatory. It's only when we ask that it do so and direct our theorizing towards this end that it's liberatory. So this is sort of the idea that, things are not neutral. And we all know, I think, as clinicians, that law is not neutral, but it may even go one step further to say, like, maybe even lawyering, maybe even social justice lawyering is not necessarily neutral. And so just always trying to sort of thinking about what does that mean for us and how do we enter the law practice, and also how do we train students on entering the law practice. And then the second person that we were inspired by was Mariama Kaba. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Mariama or read the book, We Do This Till We Free Us. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. Kaba is an abolitionist, a prison abolitionist. And one of the many, many wise things that comes out of that book is this quote: "Our charge is to make imagining liberation under oppression completely thinkable, and to really push ourselves to think beyond the normal." And so I think for the four of us who did that concurrent, the combined ideas of thinking beyond the normal and thinking about the inherent, the lack of any sort of neutrality in the law was really important to us in terms of thinking about what we meant by liberatory practice. So just kind of changing Bell Hooks' quote a little bit to say, instead of theory, lawyering is not inherently healing, liberatory, or revolutionary. And of course, in addition to that, even social justice lawyering may not necessarily be inherently healing, liberatory, or revolutionary. That's something that we have to make a conscious choice to do. And then the main thing that we pulled out from Kaba is, making liberation something that is actually possible. And that has, I would say, some particular challenges in the immigration space, but I think this may be true in all the different practice areas that we all practice in. And I can just speak from the immigration space, since that's the legal realm that I work in the most, that thinking about imagining liberation under oppression is difficult when you have laws that are not only oppressive in nature in terms of the inability of people to obtain status, but also the procedure that people have to go through is also being oppressive. And so there's a lot of things to kind of unpack and sort of get over in that particular practice area, which is why I was drawn to this as an idea. So I guess you may be thinking, like, well, why did we say liberatory practice? Because there's all these other ways that people have thought about lawyering, and we did sort of draw from it. And I guess what I would say is that I see a connection between all of the various other kind of theories that have informed lawyering outside a traditional sort of lawyer, single client, where a lawyer is counseling a client on an individual case, and maybe the lawyer is the expert on that legal issue and the client is coming to them for help, right? And we all know what all these are, but I just want to kind of review them just to kind of have a visual with everything together. So of course, we start with rebellious lawyering, Gerald Lopez's theory that you want people to be more participants in their lawyering. And I know that many of us talk about client-centered lawyering in our seminars and teach it and sort of practice it with our students. But there's also theoretical understandings that can inform our learning as well. Critical race theory obviously is one that focuses on the stories of the marginalized. I think another way of thinking about this is community lawyering, which one of the main insights, and there's large literature on all of these. So I did try to do a sort of bibliography of various readings from all of these traditions, but I'm sure there's more to add. So people should feel free to make that a living document. But community lawyering, from that literature, one of the main insights being that people who are in marginalized positions need to be able to advocate for themselves, that their sort of liberation actually comes from their own advocacy and not from a lawyer's advocacy, but that lawyers have a role in supporting communities' own advocacy efforts. Of course, intersectionality, thinking about the multiple ways in which our clients and maybe our communities that we work with more generally have overlapping and therefore multiple levels of marginalization and oppression. Social justice lawyering, which I think we could all talk about what maybe some of the differences are between rebellious community and social justice lawyering, but to me, I see a lot of similarities in terms of these aspects of lawyering that really are about centering the voice of the communities that we represent, and maybe centering them in slightly different ways, either through know your rights workshops or through only working with people who are part of social movements, or through changing the lawyer-client relationship in ways that are more social justice or more insubordination oriented, I should say. Then there's also insights from feminist and queer legal theory, right, that talk about how the law is set up to oppress women and sexual minorities, and the insights being that there are different ways of thinking about the law and maybe also different ways, well, not maybe, but definitely also different ways of thinking about our relationships to clients. Movement lawyering, again, similar to rebellious community and social justice lawyering, being about centering demands of movements and figuring out how lawyers can support those. And then I added this one in that I think I've seen recently in literature, thinking about anti-imperialism and how can we be thinking about that in our everyday legal practices, even if we're not necessarily dealing head on with U.S. imperialism or other forms of imperialism, but how do we kind of think about that in our practice? So this is a very crowded slide, but to distill all of these things into like, what do I actually mean by liberatory practice? I think it comes down to two things. And that is the relationships that we create with our students and with the matters or clients that we're working with, and also matter selection. So for me, that has been an evolution, and some of you who I've known longer may know that the clinic that I run at Suffolk has gone through an evolution from representing detainees with criminal convictions, immigrant detainees with criminal convictions who are facing deportation, to doing more affirmative cases in one of the communities here, one of the neighborhoods that has a very large immigrant population, to now really focusing on working with people who are members of organizations that are fighting for immigrants' rights in some way. So in some ways, this is the evolution that I've been through in terms of the relationship that the clinic has to the client. So it used to be very much individual client based, and then it kind of moved into community based. And now it's really more a relationship between the clinic and various organizing efforts in the Boston area. And in terms of selecting cases, that's changed as well. And so the things that I'm doing more of in the clinic are, we still do individual representation, but we do more individual representation of group members, right? Like people who are members of the organizations that we're working with. We do a lot more train the trainers. So we've developed a lot of materials and presentations for community organizers to kind of help them relay what the law is, and what are some of the ways that people can access help, and more production of materials. Some of this is self-help. Some of you may have seen, I shared, we developed a tool to help people do a Freedom of Information Act request for their own records. And that is just something that really helps lawyers be able to represent them, particularly when there's like a complicated previous immigration history. And we're developing some other tools like that as well that are like more in the area of self-help tools. And I do want to stop to say, a lot of these ideas that I had for selecting different kinds of matters came from my conversations with patients, Carla and Jennifer Lee, and Jen in particular, I think often picks matters that are going to allow students to help community members empower themselves. So they often are in a position where, you know, for example, a community organization may want to write a bill for the city council or for a state legislature or even the federal legislature. And instead of writing the bill for them, they will give the organization materials to draw on and draft language that they can use to kind of decide how they want to move forward. So some of that is the production of materials part comes from that, thinking about what are the materials that are going to make life easier basically for the organizers. How can they reach more people? How can they empower more people and build leadership amongst their membership? And then, of course, this means that there were some trade-offs. And so I am doing less what I call long-term individual representation. And any of you who do immigration work know that a lot of the immigration cases that are done by clinics, like deportation defense, like asylum applications, like green card applications, are taking a lot longer. And so I do less of those in the clinic. And that is definitely something to think about because, of course, there's an enormous need for that kind of work. And it is something that, you know, I had to think about very deeply. And so, but that was a trade-off that needed to be made in order to do more of the support for organizing. And then we do a little less representation. The second point here is really something that Carla and I have been talking about a lot, particularly in the context of representing immigrants applying for asylum, where clients have to tell their story in a particular way. And obviously there's ways to help them feel empowered in that process or as empowered as possible. And I know, you know, Layla and others have written about sort of critical interviewing and ways that people can really engage with these processes that are subordinating in ways that are maybe at least not subordinating, right? And maybe empowering as well. And I have made a decision, at least for now, to try to stay away from those applications and see what lessons can be learned from doing individual representation in contexts where you're actually lifting up the organizing work that the client has been doing rather than having to put them in a box of survival or victimhood or something like that. So concretely, I did want to say a little bit about concretely the kind of work that I'm doing in the clinic, just to give you some examples of what I mean by individual representation for members of community organizations. So one of the things that I started to realize as I was thinking about what kinds of matters I could do was that there were some wins that organizing brought about. And, you know, we, in the immigration space in particular, we think about like all of there are lots of terrible things happening, but there have been some organizing wins. And one of those was deferred action for labor enforcement. And that was won by a number of immigrants' rights labor organizations. And that finally were able to convince the Biden administration after many, many years that people should be able to get deferred action, meaning protection against deportation, if they have suffered a labor violation and there's an agency that is looking into that labor violation. So one of the things, and then the second win that happened here in Massachusetts was that a group of undocumented organizers were convinced the state legislature, again, after many years and many failed attempts at doing this, to allow undocumented people to apply for driver's licenses in Massachusetts. So those were two wins that both had local organizations working towards those wins, and also now had people who needed someone to help enforce those wins, right? Somebody to help apply for labor deferred action and somebody to help people navigate the driver's license process, which is complicated for undocumented people, many of whom may have used other people's documents in the past because driving is a necessity in Massachusetts if you're going to work. And so that was just something that those were two kinds of individual cases that I felt like we could take on and that we're going to also support the organizing. And one of the other things that's come out of doing those kinds of cases is that we also now, some of the projects that we do in the clinic are providing technical assistance for the organizations. So we've learned from our experience doing deferred action cases, and we're now providing materials, helping the organizations understand like the process and who's eligible and what's necessary, and also allowing, also developing materials that are directly for community members to understand like who might qualify. And similar on the driver's license side, we've produced materials to help people understand, you know, the risks of applying for a license, as well as the benefits and the process if you've ever, you know, used false documents in the past. And then on top of that, we also have done a bunch of know your rights trainings, community guides, like sort of essentially guides that are really directed at particular communities, including the Asian American community, the Southeast Asian American community in particular, that's been facing particular issues around, you know, having been ordered deported many years ago, but not being physically deported, so still being in the country, and like what could happen now, you know. So there's so the guides have had to go through the entire process the person probably went through before, and help organizers think about what is possible now. And so just to give you an idea of one of the things that, you know, one of the things that changed is my first class. So my first class used to be, oh, sorry, 1 second. I don't know if I'm sharing the right thing. What do you all see on your screens? You still see the PowerPoint?
We're seeing the readings.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Fall 2023.
Okay, yeah, readings on immigrant justice. Yeah. So my first class used to be very substantive, immigration law heavy, kind of an overview of the removal defense process when I was doing removal cases more, the asylum process when I was doing those cases more, SIJ, et cetera. And because of the move towards supporting organizations, my first class was really about getting to know the organizations that we were working with. So this was the kind of reading for that, and there were some discussion questions. I also assigned, and this is an article that Layla actually turned me on to many years ago, but Bill Quigley's letter to a law student interested in social justice. So I asked the students to read that piece and then think about the ways in which these organizations are engaged in social justice, and what do they anticipate their role might be in working with these organizations. And I also have them look at the memorandums of understanding that we have with these groups to see if they can figure out like what the goals are and how they might how that might be relevant to what they're doing in the clinic. So that's just one thing that I've done differently. I'm happy to talk about more things that I've been doing differently. I guess one other thing that I will share right away is that because of the, you know, every student has individual work as well as group work. I actually do every other week supervisions on individual cases, and then every other week with the groups. And that way they have a little bit more time to work on things. And also I don't have 100 meetings every week. So it's worked out pretty well. That one of the lessons I learned is that this is something that I might carry forward, depending on, of course, on, you know, how students evaluate it. But I think that is something that I probably will be carrying forward. And then, so the last thing I'll say is that I did just want to also talk a little bit about lessons learned and challenges, right? So some of the lessons that I've learned, and again, this is my first year really doing this full on. Last year, the last 2 years, I would say I was in the process of transitioning to doing this kind of work. And so I had a lot of mixed cases going on, but this is the first year that I'm doing essentially only labor deferred action, driver's license cases, and then the projects. And so one of the lessons I learned with projects, and many of you on this call probably already know this from doing these yourselves, but got to have internal deadlines projects are, I think, something that is very difficult for students to think about producing very quickly. And they can always be put off, I think, much like law review writing for us, right? And so you got to have those internal deadlines. And I try to have those line up with opportunities to present to the organization that they're working with. That is something that, in terms of one of the challenges, is there is sometimes just time limitations that the organizations have, where they can't be present or they can't review materials, and so that's just something that I'm still trying to work out. And then the other lesson I learned is that it's really important for the student to be as much as possible a direct liaison to the organization. I just find that when they talk to the organizers themselves, they have just a much better sense of why they're doing what they're doing, and what the end product should look like. That said, I think most of the relationships are mine, and so this is one of the challenges with working in this kind of project-heavy based environment. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts about this, but I think often people default to talking to me about things, like a phone call. And so that's just something I'm still working on, is trying to figure that. Another challenge of the projects they are very research and writing heavy. And so the individual cases do give students still the ability to interact with people and do interviewing, counseling. So I think a lot of the skills that that you would have from longer term individual cases are still present in the clinic. But then the challenge, I think, is trying to make the projects more than just research and writing. And then I will also say that there are some challenges institutionally. I think that doing a clinic this way is seen sometimes as more overtly political, right? Because you're working with certain organizations. So one of the organizations I have on the list that I work with is Detention Watch Network, which is a detention abolitionist organization. So they have a very specific position on immigration detention. I mean, all of these organizations have very specific positions. And so there is sort of a more overtly political bent to it. I mean, I would say it's arguable whether, if you're doing immigrant representation, there is some political statement you're making with that as well. And we're all making political statements no matter what we do. But that is just something that I encountered, that it was a little bit of pushback in terms of me changing the makeup of the cases because of the concern that it would be seen as too overtly political. And then I think another challenge is with describing what this is to students, right? It is, I think, not traditional law practice. And I think students who are in the clinics sort of see what they're doing and see how it gives them skills. But I think for students who are thinking about applying to the clinic, it's, the questions I often get are like, so what cases? Like, do you do any cases? Do you go to court? Do you do this? Do you, so I think that's just something also that is a challenge institutionally with these kinds of clinic design. So that's kind of, I think, what I wanted to share, and would love to hear folks' thoughts, questions, comments.
Yeah, we'll open up the floor. Please, if you have comments, questions, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself or raise your hand, whatever you would like to do.
I might kick off with just one thing, Ragini. I was curious to hear about like the kind of relationships with organizers and kind of the project base. Because another thing that we sometimes struggle with is how to make sure that we're being like so mindful of organizers' time and like the community partners. And so how you think about structuring the first meeting and setting them up for that relationship. I know in some ways it can be analogous to, an initial client meeting or something, but it also does seem quite different. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to like those tensions and how you set that up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's two ways, and I certainly, would love to hear other folks too, what you've done. But one thing I do before I agree to take on a project for the clinic is ask about, how much time the organizers might have. And of course that can change over the course of the year, but asking if they are open to, meeting with the students at the beginning, as well as having two other times, either when the students are presenting or having a meeting to check in and talk about feedback, and also capacity to provide feedback on things. And, people aren't always, so I think everybody sort of wants to say, yeah, I'll be able to give feedback. And then, the reality is that things happen and they're not necessarily able to do that. So then on the other end, I prepare students that, this is, take a look at the organization's website, see how many different things they're doing. And, this is somebody who's working with a community that has a lot of immediate needs. And so this may not be on their radar as their like first thing that they're going to respond to. And so it may take, a little bit of time to hear back from folks and not to feel like that's any indication of the work that the students are doing. So I try to manage it both those ways. That said, I think that, we're in February now, and there are some students who are feeling like they haven't gotten feedback that they needed. And so, we're gonna continue to work on figuring that out before the end of the semester. But it's definitely, I think, something to prepare the students for. That it's not like individual clients who often are, or particularly individual clients who are in removal proceedings, who are often like, responding right away.
I have a question about kind of how you initiate the work. I've worked with a lot of organizers here in Austin, Texas. I'm at the University of Texas School of Law, and I'll reach out to groups that I know are doing good work and interesting work. And I think it's their first experience potentially having been contacted by the law school, by a lawyer, and they have so much work that they're already focused on. It can be hard for them to create an idea of, oh, I completely get this. I know how I can get a clinic involved. Here's the pamphlet that I'm going to give you, and no problem. It often takes, I think, creativity on my part, which I'm fine with, but it also kind of runs into the tension of, I don't want to be the one bringing the work to them of this is what we can do. What do you think? I want it to be the organizers telling us what they need. So I wonder if you can speak to any experience or thoughts you have around helping organizers come up with ideas without putting those ideas on them.
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I will say that in some ways it's a work in progress. So I think and I imagine you do this as well. The first thing I do is, like you, most of the organizers I've worked with already in the past, and this is the first time I'm approaching them to say, hey, I also run a law school clinic that might be able to help you. And so I ask them to say a little bit about what are some of the things that they're doing that they wish there were more people on. And some of those things are just not things that law students are going to be able to do, but that is how a couple of the projects came up. So with Detention Watch Network, we did a guide for their members on, essentially like risk of arrest at airports, right, or near the border. And then same thing with Asian American Resource Workshop. They were like, well, we've been like, everybody's been wanting this guide forever and nobody's doing it. And so I was like, okay, well, I think law students could do that. But there are also things where I have to say, no, I don't think that that's appropriate. Or let me actually do it this way. So one lesson I learned, I took one project on that I thought would be going to be great for law students, where they were going to be researching litigation strategies to close down detention centers. And then it turned out that there's no such claim. So we, spun, and I should have probably done the research myself first to see what was out there. But we kind of looked in all different crevices. and realize, like, at least under existing decisions out there, there really isn't a claim that has successfully led to the closure of a detention facility. Usually closure is because of like bad media attention and all the organizing strategies, not the legal strategies. So so I think that sorry, that was kind of a long answer, but the answer is really like trying to figure out from them, what do they want more people on, and seeing if any of those things translate into something that law students could work on.
Ragini, I have a question as well that may resonate. So I love this model. It's a model I used to follow when I ran a clinic at UCLA, and one of the key learning moments, or maybe even disorienting moments, that I found that students had was when they were meeting with organizers or partners or other stakeholders and felt that they really needed to come with a solution. They really needed to come with a framework. They really needed to, on their agenda, have like, we've thought about your problem and we have this list of options for you. And at some point, one of our amazing partners kind of quieted them down and was like, I'm not asking you to review a contract. I need your brain at the table. That's what I'm asking you to do.
Right.
But that was a very fortuitous moment that we had this partner say that in the exact time that it was needed. And when those times don't come, I'm curious about your strategies for helping students understand that they are playing a particular role as a team member, as a partner, versus finding a particular legal outcome for a legal problem that they've been presented.
Yeah, this is another really good question. And I won't say that I've done this, you know, successfully in all cases, but I try to ask students to reflect on really this first class and like what were the goals, and what were the roles that they envisioned for themselves then, and what do they think their role is now, and going back to the goals that the organization has, or that the organizing is moving towards, and just kind of seeing if they can come up with themselves, like, oh yeah, maybe we don't need to present this like canned list of answers. Maybe it's actually better to you know, be doing this sort of back and forth. And I will say I'm also kind of lucky because there's a couple of organizers who have really made time for giving feedback, and they sort of model this, you know, like, so they've seen this modeled. And then even during my intensive session, I had a lawyer who works with one of the organizations come, and they sort of modeled this relationship as well in conversation. It just kind of came up naturally, but they ended up modeling this conversation. So I broke that down. I was like, I think we need to replicate that. But that said, I think there's still times when, you know, that's what students are trained to do, right? Like that's what they want to be able to do. And so that is sometimes their go-to. And sometimes I'm not successful, so the students still go to the meeting with the list. And often the organizers are, you know, very polite and sort of say, okay, great, and like, this isn't really what we wanted, but okay. And then we kind of move from there.
Other questions, comments, ideas?
Okay, I'll ask another question. Hi. So one thing that I think the students, and we really, I think we kind of just addressed this, but I get from the students sometimes is, I don't have to be a lawyer to do this. And I know that this comment about, we don't need you to draft a contract, we just need your brain, I think that's really compelling, and I'm certainly going to be using that. But what is your, I guess, what is the response to that? Because I have very strong feelings, and I have my own answer that I kind of tell the students to really think about it. But how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I would, you know, on this one, I will say, I think some of this is local, like local to the schools. So a lot of the students that I have are from the communities that we're working with. And so I actually haven't heard anyone say that. So I haven't actually had to deal with that comment. Yeah, I'm curious how other people.
Well,
You know, we had I have like a little bit of like a thought. We had this project where we worked with SPLC, and we were looking at immigrant habeas cases in the Western District of Louisiana. And as part of that, we had the students like coding cases, and they had to learn how to use Qualtrics. And then we wrote this report based on that. The students were livid that they were having to learn how to use Qualtrics. And I think it was like grounded in this, like, this isn't the law. Like, what are these legal skills? And part of it was like understanding the stakes of the issue. But then I think another part of it is this like larger question of like, what is lawyering? What is advocacy? We are teaching you critical analysis and thinking, and that goes beyond simply reading statutes, regulations, and case law and making an analysis of what that means and then filing something in court. And like, you know, we often, you know, have a class about just like the limits of lawyering, about like broader advocacy. And so like kind of teaching that this is a skill, like being able to like learn new skills and think about problems more broadly that have like a legal core or a legal element, but that are broader than that. And so that's part of it. And part of it truthfully is like they had to come to that realization. And so they were actually just very angry at us for a portion of the semester until they kind of got beyond that and got to the like beyond all the discomfort and like really had some deep learning and like could have reflections about it. So I don't know if that's satisfying, but
no, that's very helpful. And I will say, in the defense of my students, some of them say it from the approach of, I am an abolitionist, or I'm wanting to do this work. Why did I even go to law school? Like, it's not that the work is necessarily beneath them as a lawyer. It's that I didn't have to go to law school to do this work. So it's both ways, but I think your answer is very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess only one other thing I would say about that is I think I love the idea, Layla, of building in some classes to help people think about the limits of lawyering, or like how does lawyering fit into a larger picture? And you know, there's tons of readings that just tons of articles that talk about just the limits. Like there's just limits to what law can do, but that doesn't mean there's not a role for lawyers. So to your point about, you know, trying to lift up students who feel like it was a waste of time to go to law school, there are some things that lawyers can do, or even just some things that you learned, like the way to communicate with people that might be useful.
And Leah, just as someone who did respond in that moment and had students kind of not know what to do with it, I found that a lot of their fears and or frustrations came from being really fearful. Like they were students actually that weren't coming from the same communities of our organizers. And so they were fearful about how they would be perceived, if they were being somehow misunderstood or offending somebody. And so they were really afraid of the unknown. And so they were relying on like a legal structure because at least they knew how to research that. At least they knew how to bring that to the meeting. And so we talked about ways in which they could kind of anticipate the unknowns and be prepared for it and be ready to just engage. And so they learned like how to run a meeting. They learned how to set an agenda and invite feedback from their partners and their stakeholders. They learned how it was more of an exchange than sort of a transaction. You know, I mean, I guess those are the same things, but more of a conversation than a transaction, I guess. And in those moments, like Layla and Ragini were saying, they learned that these were skills that they actually needed in their legal and non-legal lives. Any other burning questions? Comments? Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I know that I've learned a lot and been inspired, and really appreciate, Ragini, you sharing with us this notion of liberatory lawyering and liberatory justice. Thanks to everybody so much for joining us. This will be available on the CLEA website in just a few days, and we invite you again to stay tuned and come back and join us for our 2 sessions in April to close out the semester. But happy mid-semester, everybody. And thanks again, Ragini. So great to see you and have you with us.
Thank you both. Thanks, everyone.